So let's start basic here. Why do we watch porn?
That's a good question that, interestingly enough, took some time for researchers to really do a careful look at understanding. The answer is actually quite simple, though. I mean, so on the one hand, we do watch porn for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into, but the vast majority of the time, people watch pornography because it's pleasurable, because they enjoy doing it. And so, I don't want to offend any sensitive listeners, but ultimately, when people view pornography, it's almost always accompanied by masturbation with the goal of having an orgasm. And so people most often report that they watch pornography because they would like to have an orgasm, that it would be an easier way to facilitate that it heightens the experience, that it makes the experience more enjoyable. But some version ultimately of they watch porn to make masturbation easier. So that's probably the most common, this pleasure-seeking drive. In a lot of our research, we call it a hedonic drive, but seeking pleasure. There are other reasons, though. So sometimes people view porn because a partner wants them to. So one partner is driving it and they want to do it together as a couple. Sometimes people view pornography because they're trying to escape from negative emotions. They're feeling lonely. They're feeling sad, depressed. Viewing pornography, like any other recreational activity, consumes your attention for a little bit, so you don't have to pay attention to those other things. And then another one that people often forget is one of the most common reasons people view pornography also is after pleasure. One of the most common is boredom. I'm bored. Mm-hmm. It's something to do. I mean, this is actually one of the reasons we saw porn use spike up a little bit right at the beginning of the pandemic. Not because people, I'm going to die, I'm going to view porn. It's because people were stuck at home and they were bored. And then it leveled off because people found other pastimes. So,
I mean, so I think about you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think about this connection between food and sex. And so we crave both on some level. And the idea that I don't watch people eat food, but you can watch people have sex. I don't get the same pleasure or whatnot. Is that a strange comparison?
No, I think the analogy, so something we often see is people try to compare pornography to various types of drugs or illegal activities or things like that, especially people that have very strong objections to porn. And I think most of those analogies are flawed. Food is the best analogs for pornography. And what I mean by that is we all have hunger drives that are baked into our DNA, if you will. We crave food because without food we die. And from a species level kind of perspective, like looking at humans, we crave sex because without sex, the species doesn't exist anymore. It's literally evolutionarily selected for that we would want to have sex. And so I think that basic human drive aspect of it means that pornography and food are quite similar in many regards. Now, you're right, it's not perfect. Part of the reason, food, I mean, people do enjoy watching food, but being made, or there's entire genres of TikTok videos and other social media, people watching people making and eating food. But pornography obviously is a bigger deal in that regard, because there does seem to be some uniquely visual components to sexuality that activate sexual drives in ways that maybe they don't activate food drives when you're watching people eating. I mean, there are some parallels, but it's not a perfect analogy. Just like most analogies are never quite perfect.
Sure, there's not a McDonald's after dark website where
right.
So let's talk about friction for a second, and friction in the sense of where we are with the ease of us getting pornography now, where it is readily available at any given time, whereas decades prior, and pornography, as we know, has been around forever. Decades prior, it was having to go into a video store and get pornography and worry about, first of all, the worry of getting in your car and going to the store, getting somebody seeing you in there. It creates all kinds of friction where a lot of people probably said, you know what, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to go, or I'm not going to go as often as I would now with it online. And even prior to that before. So where are we with that when there's almost no friction to watching porn? how does that impact us when it comes to us being just overwhelmed with it, I guess?
Right. And so, I mean, you do raise a good point. And even more than the physical effort and the time, it's the affordability, right?
Right.
So historically, porn was almost never free. Whereas now the notion that you would pay for your porn is actually quite radical to some people. And so it's certainly the ease of entry, the access barriers have gone down. And so porn is very accessible on the computers we carry around in our pockets and call smartphones. Like, it's something that we have with us all of the time now if we want to have access to it. And it does seem to influence, both the variety of pornography people have access to and the ways that they access it. And there's it depends on how you read the literature. And I mean, something that I should be very straightforward about is almost all of the pornography literature is filled with contradiction, and not in it's very problematic way, but in the sense that, like, any kind of burgeoning area, you can find lots of what seems like conflicting evidence, and it takes time to kind of reconcile and give a clear narrative. So we do know that it seems likely that younger persons, and so I mean adolescents, sometimes childhood, but particularly adolescents, seem to be seeing pornography more readily and more often than maybe previous generations did. And that access barrier is a part of that. So that's something we think about. But also, the fact that, I mean, depending on the studies you look at, somewhere between 70 and 99% of men report viewing pornography in the past year, and something between 15 and 40% of women report viewing pornography in the past year. We know that at this point it's entering kind of the cultural awareness as just a pastime. Like, it's just a thing that people do. Some people play video games, some people view porn. Like, it's just something that people do on their own time to relax, to unwind, to do something pleasurable. And it's just kind of is. And so it's increasingly, I mean, there's still taboos around it undoubtedly, but it's less taboo than it used to be because everyone's doing it, so to speak.
So thinking about this idea of it being so available to us. So I think about it in terms of, well, being numb, and with regard to, I mean, I won't call myself a porn connoisseur, but I certainly have seen it. And, everyone looks like they're in such great shape. And so so we start talking about, we'll get into couples and individuals in a second, but it seems to me like, having this available to us and watching it all the time, does it create an unrealistic view of what humans look like, what sexual roles look like, and whatnot? I mean, does it change our perception of reality?
Right. And so that's a great question. And I think, like most things that I'll answer today, the answer is complex. I will say increasingly amateur porn, or real porn, if you will, is increasingly popular. People are increasingly interested in, bodies that look like theirs and bodies that look like prospective partners they may have. Having said that, you're absolutely right. There is still a huge portion of the pornography market is dominated by a very fit actors and actresses. Oftentimes, in the case of the women that act in porn, there have been surgical enhancements of various types. So there's lots of aspects of that that come into play. I mean, we do know from various, there have been some studies that suggest that men viewing porn often have more body image concerns, particularly men who have sex with men, which is the researcher term for gay and bisexual men. Viewing gay and bisexual porn, there's often, some body image concerns. We see women whose partners regularly consume porn have more body image concerns about themselves. And then men who more regularly view porn have more, what's the best word? Penis anxiety, if you will, about the size of their own genitals and things like that. So, at the end of the day, and this is truly one of my biggest concerns as someone who does pornography research, is the way that it's shaping sexual scripts. So I do a lot of research on pornography addiction, which I actually think is much less of a concern than most people are worried that it is. And I think there needs to be more concern about this idea of how pornography shapes sexual scripts. At the end of the day, the vast majority of pornography is produced as a fantasy, and it is just a fantasy, just in the sense that you don't go watch the Avengers and then assume that you are Iron Man. You probably shouldn't go watch porn and assume that that's what sexuality actually looks like. Now, for a lot of adults, that's an easy message to internalize, especially if you're regularly sexually active. You can probably differentiate what your real sex life feels like versus what porn looks like, and see that those are two different things. Younger people that have less regular sexual encounters, people that are in, for whatever reason, not sexually active, it's possible. I mean, I don't have strong evidence on this, but it's certainly possible that this could be shaping their views of sexuality in ways that are concerning, though. And that is something, whether you want to call it, well, what communication scholars call it. So I'm in psychology, but communication scholars look at this as sexual script modeling, which is a fancy word for saying pornography is affecting how people develop ideas about how sex is supposed to work, what they like in sexuality, and how they act in sexual encounters. And there is certainly evidence, especially in adolescents and young adults, that is happening, that it is shaping that approach to sexuality.
So diving a little further into the body image concern element that you just mentioned, I mean, so if somebody's worried about or thinking about their, they're listening to this and they're thinking about their self-esteem, or maybe they're thinking about their partner's self-esteem and their own body image concerns, is it laying off of the porn to get rid of some of those comparisons? I mean,
right.
How do you address that?
Well, we don't have a lot of great intervention studies, unfortunately, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But the general advice that I have done as a therapist, if someone has these concerns, is taking, if it's for you, so it's very different issues. If it's your partner has concerns about your porn viewing versus you having concerns, are kind of two different problems. If you have concerns about your pornography viewing and it's related to body image concerns or things like that, taking time to make a very clear inventory of what you're concerned about. It's easy to say, I kind of feel bad after I view porn. Okay, well, let's dive into understanding what that is, identifying those clear concerns, and then deciding for yourself, and if you're talking to a mental health professional, you can talk about it as well, obviously. But does these concerns, valid? Are they things that I really need to be focused on? Do I need to change my behavior? Do I need to change the concerns? And that sounds kind of vague, but it does matter, right? So if you're kind of feeling bad about viewing pornography because it violates your religious beliefs, you may decide, hey, I can't view porn with this belief. I need to change that behavior. But if you're saying, well, sometimes I just feel like I'm wasting time, well, maybe you can cut yourself some slack and say it's okay to just enjoy yourself sometimes. And body image it's very hard to say which way it should be. Well, if it's creating these issues for you, which is hard to kind of pin down, but if it is, then maybe laying off is the issue. But perhaps you already just had some body image concerns and porn's highlighting them, in which case maybe the goal should be to work on the body image concerns themselves rather than the porn itself. And so it could look different for each person.
Do people start to, the idea of fantasy of what this is? Do people, and we'll get to individuals and couples in a second, but do people start to think about they translate the fantasy of porn into their real lives? And what I mean by that is that they might avoid a committed relationship with someone because they think, every day that they get up, their car's going to break down and an attractive mechanic is going to help them. And oh my gosh, they forgot their wallet. And how are they going to pay? Do they start to say, well, I'm not going to be in a committed relationship because I'm seeing this fantasy and I think it can be my own life as well? If that makes sense.
That seems less likely. I mean, there is some very tentative evidence that people that view pornography regularly are less likely to commit in the future to long-term relationships, but that's probably the result of other variables. And the other piece of this is the things that people take from pornography and then start to integrate into their own lives is often less around the plot line, if you will, and more around the sexual acts themselves. So if you look at people that regularly view pornography, they're more likely to report practices like a variety of sexual practices. So, assuming heterosexual interaction here, more likely to try things like anal sex, more likely to think that the facial, the money shot, the ejaculating on a woman's face is part of normal sexuality, more likely to try things like spanking and choking and things like that are very common in pornography. So that's actually where we see the integration happening, which is possibly a cause for concern. But it's less the grand kind of plot stuff, because frankly, nobody watches porn for the plot.
Yeah, we're never watching to see, what's going to happen. Are they going to
I wonder what's going to happen. Yeah.
What's going to happen? Are they all going to get their clothes back on before the plane lands? Because how embarrassing would that be?
Right.
So you talked a little bit. Let's dive into the individuals and couples for a second. So it seems like the common, I guess, misconception based upon what you said is that if people are watching a lot of porn and they're single, why would they bother go and find a committed relationship, because they're paying the bills, for lack of a better term,
right,
on their own? You're suggesting otherwise. Is that right?
So there's, a couple of things, right? So we do, there are cases that you can identify of people that say, well, porn is just easier, I'm not going to even try to have a partner sexual encounter. Those cases are more rare. And the reason being, even people that regularly view pornography, even daily view pornography, tend to prefer real life sexual encounters. Like the reality is, as much as porn may help you achieve an orgasm, we still have this drive to have, at the end of the day, people want to have sexual experiences with other people. Like, we're kind of innately driven to want other people to help us have an orgasm. So that's part of it. Now having said that, it does change the willingness people seem to exhibit in some circumstances to pursue sexuality. So things that we see, in couples, now this is a chicken or egg problem, but in couples where one partner is regularly viewing pornography and the other is not, they tend to report much lower levels of sexual activity between them in the marriage. So the stereotypical, right, is the man's viewing porn and the woman's not, and they're having less sex. Now the question is he viewing porn because they're having less sex, or is they having less sex because he's viewing porn? Mm-hmm. And it's hard to differentiate that, but we do know that it does. People are probably less likely to be constantly cruising for sex, if you will. I think the internet just in general has changed how we approach relationships. I'm going to go to the bar and pick someone up and hope if I get lucky, we'll go home together. That just doesn't happen as much anymore, but I don't even know that that's just pornography. I think that's the whole digital age.
Right.
You hook up with somebody on a hookup app if you're lucky, and that's how that works. So it's kind of hard to answer that question. And having said that, there is a tiny bit of evidence to suggest, people who porn more regularly now in the future may be less likely to have sex. Some evidence goes the other way, though. So it's a little complicated.
So for couples, then, this idea of, we kind of alluded to this idea of secrecy, that if one's watching and the other doesn't know about it, that could be an issue. Is there an element of transparency there that could be useful for couples when it comes to porn?
So transparency is huge, right? So like, if you tell me one person's viewing pornography in the relationship and the other's not, from that point on, the best predictor of whether or not there's going to be relationship issues related to porn is the transparency piece. If both members of the couple are like, yeah, I know my partner views porn, it's fine, whatever, then chances are the porn is not going to be creating problems in the relationship. Now, if it's secret, if it's hidden, if it's kind of stashed away somewhere, then you're more likely to see. So transparency is huge. And that's the way it is for most aspects of couple relationships in general. Transparency within the relationship helps. And there is some studies to suggest that couples that openly dialogue about porn are also more likely to explore sexual fantasies together. And I don't necessarily mean those concerning practices maybe that I mentioned earlier. I mean, just in general, like maybe you do decide you guys like role play, or maybe you do decide to try different positions, or maybe you do decide that there's certain specific sexual techniques that you like, that you have explored and discovered together through the openness that came about by dialoguing about porn. So there are examples of that, but there's also examples of trying to hide it away, and then the spouse finding, and it turns into a fight and then divorce. Like, so, you know, you see harmful examples as well.
You talk in a paper that you published earlier this year about this idea of moral incongruence and porn use. Where is that a problem, and how does it manifest itself, I guess?
Right. So moral incongruence is actually one of my biggest research areas. It's an area we kind of pioneered. Sam Perry is a colleague of mine. Sam and I kind of pioneered this a few years back. Published on it a lot since. It's a very, you know, academic $10 word, right? For saying some people viewing pornography violates their beliefs, and they do it anyway, which is not surprising, right? We violate our beliefs all the time. We have ideals for our behavior that we then fall short of all the time. So that happens with porn. We call it moral incongruence. The most common version of this is the conservative religious individual who believes that pornography viewing is wrong, but yet they still are kind of driven to do it. Sometimes they do it, they feel terrible about it. So, you know, extreme examples of this moral incongruence driving addictions can be seen almost anytime you see a popular religious leader claiming to have a sex addiction or something like that. But it happens very commonly too. I mean, churches across the country, Catholic churches, Latter-day Saint churches, evangelical Christian churches in particular in the US, are filled with support groups for people dealing with porn addiction. And now I use air quotes because these are people that are viewing porn once a month, twice a month, and they have an addiction, probably not actually addiction. They probably just feel terrible because it violates their beliefs. Their beliefs tell them that porn is wrong and they're doing it. Why do I keep doing this thing that I feel bad about? I must have an addiction. It's probably not that simple. It's probably you have a sex drive and this is an outlet for it. Now, having said that, I want to be clear, if moral incongruence about viewing pornography, the solution is not in your religion. The solution is not to say, well, I should probably just feel great about viewing porn. It's normal. The solution is probably trying to live up to your values without feeling shame and self-hate when you fall short of them. So instead of viewing pornography as this terrible thing that you have an addiction or that it's ruining your life, perhaps it's better to think of it like, well, when you hit snooze too many times, or when you you get frustrated with your kids or something like that. Like it's a shortcoming maybe according to your belief system, but it's something you pick yourself back up from and you just keep moving on rather than dwelling on and fixating on.
I'll get you out of here on this. When does porn use cross the line to become too much?
So that's a hard question to answer, but it's one that I've devoted a lot of my research career to trying to answer. And honestly, objectively, there's not a set point. My take as both a therapist and a researcher is at the individual level, porn use is too much. Either it's causing real problems in your life, like you're viewing it at work or you're viewing it when you're supposed to be doing other things and there's consequences. So that's one scenario. Or when you feel like it's too much. If you feel like your porn is too much, it is not my job to say it's not. It's my job to say, all right, well, how do we get you to a place where you don't feel that way anymore? And that may mean cutting down on your porn use. And so as much as I'd like to say X number of hours, I've seen people that view porn 30 minutes, an hour a day, no consequences in their life, no problems. It's just part of their life. It's not creating any distress. Okay, that's fine for them. And I see people that view porn for 30 minutes every 2 weeks, and it's creating a lot of distress. And so we talk about how do we bring that down and also not freak out about it when you do that. So it is kind of finding that balance of making sure it's not interfering with the rest of your life and making sure that you can feel okay about where it is and kind of going forward from there.
And it sounds like that's kind of so for folks listening, it's kind of that reflective process. Is that what I'm hearing?
And that's one of the big things. So I'm a licensed psychologist. I'm saying this about all sorts of issues all the time. I don't have a set prescription on what you should or should not be doing as far as quantity or things like that. What I can tell you is what you do should be mindful and intentional. And so the digital age makes it hard sometimes. We often get just in a flow state or kind of zombied out doing whatever we're doing, and we're just doing it because. If your pornography viewing is mindful and intentional, it's probably better than if you're just viewing porn mindlessly for no apparent reason.
Which certainly wouldn't necessarily be the good acting that's going on in these videos.
Right, fair enough.
Dr. Joshua Grubbs is Associate Professor in the Clinical Psychology PhD program at Bowling Green State University. Joshua, thanks so much for joining me today.
All right. Glad to be here.